Welcome to the business interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. This time around, we're talking about the growing gaps between high and low income earners. In the United States, income inequality seemed to have soared to its highest level since the Great Depression. And we're seeing similar trends in many Western European countries. My guest today argues that it spells bad news for growth in the entire global economy. Kemal Dervish is a former Turkish finance minister and the former head of the United Nations Development Programme. Now he's vice president and head of the Global Economy and Development Programme at the Brookings Institution, an American think tank. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I read this during my research for this program. The average chief executive in the United States in the S&P 500 earned 42 times more than the average US worker in 1980. Now that same ratio in 2011 has grown to 380 times more. Why is that bad news in your opinion?
There's an ethical side, there's a philosophical side. Those are different. People can have different appreciations of this, different levels of tolerance, if you like, for inequality. But what really worries me is that the extreme concentration of income at the very top creates a serious macroeconomic imbalance, in the sense that there's a lot of profit, there's a lot of money, interest rates are at record lows, and yet we don't see investment. We don't see, new projects, employment creation at the level one would want to have, given the amount of investable resources available. And when you ask people, the main reason is that they're not sure of demand. They're not sure that there'll be enough demand. Well, one of the reasons they're not sure that there's not enough demand is that wages are growing much more slowly than productivity in the US and in quite a few other countries. In China, for example, for a long time it was the case. And so long-term, middle-class, broad-based demand, which was the great success of capitalism in the 50s and 60s, when the whole middle class was profiting from the system, we don't see that. Median incomes are stagnating in large parts of the advanced world.
As you say, there's an ethical part of this discussion as well, but if we look purely at the economical side, does it mean then that chief executives and other high income earners, that they're hoarding too much money for themselves? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not necessarily the individuals as such, but it's also the corporations that are not investing. And when you have a very large part of the national income, I mean, how many private planes, how many yachts, how many luxurious homes can you demand? I mean, there's a limit to that. And in that end of the market, there's no problem. But there's a problem for the average American, for the average Chinese. I mean, China is having the same kind of system, the same kind of syndrome with a very different system.
But there is this so-called trickle-down theory that if high earners earn more, that money will eventually find its way down the system to low and middle-income earners. Are you completely discounting that theory?
Not completely, but largely. It takes forever, it literally trickles, it doesn't flow. And it doesn't generate that healthy, widespread demand for new goods, for growth that you get when the middle class fully profits from economic growth, which was the case in Europe, in Japan, in the US for many years, and which allowed the democratic system, markets to triumph over the centralized, bureaucratic Soviet-type system. But we are now facing a new phenomenon where the income concentration is getting really excessive. Now, Europe is not quite at that point yet. Many countries in Europe are more balanced. Germany is definitely, there's large middle class, in France also. But we see the beginnings of the same trends getting stronger here also in Europe. In Italy, they're quite strong, in Spain. And of course, the crisis in Europe, with all the measures that are now being taken and which unfortunately again fall on the weakest parts of society, will exacerbate the problem.
So more austerity also means more or growing income gaps.
It will mean, it has meant it for Europe over the last two years. I think the new French government is trying its best to find the package that combines budgetary responsibility and fiscal progress and less deficits with social balance and social solidarity, but it's very difficult.
Now, what you're saying it makes a lot of blue-blooded capitalists quite uneasy. For instance, higher taxes in the United States, it's been a no-go area for many years over there. We have seen similar movements and similar concerns here in Europe as well. How do we do something about the problem?
You're right, there's resistance. Nobody likes to pay taxes. It's a normal human, feeling. I don't blame people for not being happy about it. But one has to remember, you don't get good social services and protection of the state and security, and all these things have to be paid for by somebody. And if you have made huge gains, 94% of all income gains made 1 year ago in the US, we don't have the figures for the last year, were made by the top 1%, 94%. Well, as President Obama has said during the election campaign, he's not asking for the moon, he's asking for a modest increase in the tax rates for the most wealthy Americans.
But redistribution, in your mind, it is the only way. Higher taxes for higher income earners.
Yeah, it can also be a reduction of tax exemptions, of loopholes. It has to be a package. And President Obama, despite what he said, has after all won the election in the United States, which, as you said, is one of the countries that is most kind of worried about taxation. So I think people are agreeing with the message that everybody has to contribute, and those who have a lot and who've gained a lot have to contribute more.
Now, you've drawn parallels between domestic income inequalities in certain countries and the need to rebalance the entire global economy. Talk us through what you mean and what you believe.
Well, actually, in terms of the global economy, as opposed to what's happening in the advanced economies, there is good news. The emerging markets have grown fast. There is a cyclical downturn which is worldwide, but if you look at the trend growth rates, you have had hundreds of millions of people who lived in really very great poverty emerging from that poverty over the last 10, 20 years. So there is some good news. Global markets are creating wealth, are creating dynamism.
So income gaps between countries, they're actually
between
narrowing.
Countries, if you take the developing countries and emerging markets as a whole, and the advanced rich countries as a whole, income gaps are narrowing quite significantly. And that, of course, is a new historical phenomenon which will create a different kind of world 10 to 20 years from now. So we're talking about relatives here. Now, of course, in the emerging markets too now, particularly in China, and also to some degree in India, inequalities are increasing inside again. So hopefully they will not. China is already as unequal as the US, which is kind of interesting for a country, which comes from the political past that it comes from. So there are technological factors. There are factors which are called winner-take-all markets. If you take a market, you take the whole world. In the old days, you would take your city, or you would take your country market. Now, if you're a winner, you take the whole world. And being a winner, of course, is a good thing. But if you're a winner, then agree to share some of your gains with the overall needs that the world community has. We do need services. We do need medical care when we're old. We do need environment. We need to take care of climate issues. We do need to have good roads. We do need to have good schools. Somebody has to pay for that.
But practically, you're saying that countries in Northern Europe, Germany, Sweden, other countries in Northern Europe, that they need to basically export less and import more.
The best would be export more, but import even more. In other words, reduce the Northern European countries, including the Scandinavian countries and the Northern Eurozone countries around Germany, are basically running a current account surplus of $500 billion a year, which is 100 billions more than China ever did.
So they're being selfish.
They are, it's not just a question of selfishness. I think they're just being wrong. Why? I'm not asking them to give more to the South. All I'm asking is that they let their own wages increase and their own people live better. So in a sense, they would be doing everybody a favor, including themselves, if they pursued somewhat more expansionary policies. Not irresponsible, not policies that distribute money to everybody or let wages rise to wipe out competitiveness, but much more than they have been doing over the last 10 years. Wages in Germany should rise at 6-7% a year for the next 2-3 years. It's beginning, and that's a good thing.
Just looking ahead, we're almost at the end of this interview, but just looking ahead in 2013, do you think that emerging economies will continue growing to the extent that we have seen them growing in the past few years? Or do you think that they will take a hit because of the Eurozone crisis, because of low growth in North America?
They will, and they are already in 2012 taking a hit. Brazil is almost down to 0. Turkey has gone from 8 to 3.5. China from 9 to 7.5, India from 8 to 6. So that there's an overall slowdown. However, there's a difference between India growing at 5.5%, which is slow for India, and the Eurozone not growing at all, at 0, or the US growing maybe at 2% or 1.5%. So the differential will be there. The emerging market economies will grow faster as a whole, with some exceptions here and there, than the advanced countries. But when the advanced countries do badly, the emerging countries will also slow down. And now it also works in reverse. When the emerging markets if China had a crisis, I don't know, due to some internal factor, political or whatever, and slowed down by itself, not as a reaction to the outside world, it will have a negative effect on the US, on Europe.
We're more linked than ever before.
We are more linked than ever before.
All right. Thanks very much indeed, Kemal Dervish. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
And with that, we're going to wrap up the program. Thanks for watching the business interview here on France 24. Do stay with us. We have more news coming your way.